So, go! I also feel like Chris Farley on that Saturday Night Live, skit where it's like, it's so awesome, The Unforgiven.
It says in the program that we're icons, and I figured out, what's icons? And I realized that means we're 75 years old.
It means other things too. It means other things too. So, like I said, I kind of want to keep things a little bit casual. And my first question is, I ask everybody that I get a chance to meet with in these venues, is what was it about film that attracted you? It's a medium that some people, I saw Star Wars when I was 10, and it completely changed me, for better or worse. And at that point, I was just hooked. I was hooked. I was going to do film, no matter what, even though my parents were like, no, you're not. So what was it about film that drew you?
Our first date was Wild Strawberries.
Oh my God, okay. Yeah. It wasn't like a Peck and Paw film or?
No.
Okay. No.
So
it was a period when there was a switch. Kids going to college and right ahead of us wanted to write the great American novel, and somehow we were right on that point when it began to turn. We were ahead of the curve in the sense that that it was an unusual thing, and thank God there weren't a lot of other people doing it because we'd have never made it. But it was there were only 3 film schools in the United States, I think. There was NYU, there was UCLA, and there was USC. It wasn't a common thing. There were a few books out about stuff. There was nothing to learn. You couldn't get your hands on a screenplay, and at least not in Northern California where we were. If we'd lived in LA, that might have been different. But there was no way to get into the business. There was no route or anything. So, but seeing movies, we just wanted to be involved with movies somehow, and I ended up volunteering at a local television station and becoming sort of assistant cameraman, assistant editor, and all that. And then they helped me get a job as a news film cutter. So we're trying to be in the business, but we were a long way from the business. And at that time, for myself, I don't think this is true of Janet, but for myself, I had nothing but contempt for the written word. I'd come up through all that, you got to read all the novels and you got to be a writer, and of course I'd tried all that stuff, but the fact is the written word compared to the image was just nothing. So I wanted to be in shooting stuff and editing stuff, and I didn't want anything to do with anything written. Mm-hmm. And you weren't quite that way, but
No, I still expected to write novels or short stories. But then, because David was having success, every time people would become part of our community, they started asking me to do things. And we were in documentaries for a long time. And then I didn't ever have to write a spec screenplay. I got asked to write my first feature film in LA. I was very lucky. And the whole time that I was becoming a screenwriter, I fell in love with the form of screenwriting. To me, it's like poetry. It's like, if that sounds strange to people, you have a story, but you're putting it down on the page, and it's all the descriptions, and you can't say how someone was feeling, but you can put the emotions with all of the words down. And we go back and we look at our early screenplays, and they really feel like poetry to me. And maybe that sounds silly, but I fell in love with that form.
Mm-hmm. We say when we're teaching screenwriting that the word, it's your currency, and you want to spend a certain amount of that to get whatever you want to get across. Going back to some of the previous jobs you had, editing. Did editing have? Because I see writing and editing and directing really linked together, especially editing when you're writing a script. Did that have an influence?
Yeah, absolutely. It was I didn't know it at the time. I mean, I wasn't making a plan. Mm-hmm. But when I later became a writer, I became aware of just how much editing helped me. And it was a combination, interestingly, of one of the few people who did write about film in those days and wrote about it beautifully was William Goldman. and I would read William Goldman books, and I got a hold also of a couple of his screenplays through, some were published, but there was one that was unpublished, his thing about Horn, because it hadn't been made at the time. And what was interesting, I found that it was eye-opening to me to read one of his screenplays, because he seemed to put the movie on paper. You read it, you saw the movie in front of you. There wasn't a lot of this and that and stuff. It was just, I'll never forget, it said, exterior, a flag waves in the breeze. 20 soldiers drill in the stockade. In other words, exterior stockade, flag waves in the breeze. In other words, he set it up with a close-up, never mentioned close-up or anything, set it up with a wide shot so that he knew what you were seeing. And I realized, not only did I learn from that, but I also realized I was more than some other people, and very much more than Europeans who have a very different style of writing screenplays. Not to say there's anything wrong with it, but it's just different. I thought in terms of what was on the screen. I didn't think in terms of an abstract story that a novelist might think of, and I never learned how to do what a novelist does, much as I admire. But they're building something around there. I was giving them, this is on the screen now, and then I would write, cut to, and this is on the screen next. And by that, I don't mean that I was writing shots, like giving somebody directions. I mean, I had in mind what we were seeing. So that worked for me as a screenwriter. It was good.
Can you talk about, Blade Runner was such a, I don't know, how many versions of that film are out there?
So far.
Yeah, so far, right, yeah.
So far. I've seen more than you have, too. Trust me.
I believe it. I'm having, my 13-year-old is reading the Philip K. Dick, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, and he has not seen Blade Runner yet, so I'm excited to show him this. It's a film that doesn't age at all.
You want to know a secret?
No, I don't. Is it going to shatter my whole
I wish you'd
like,
tell me what happens in the book, because I've never read it.
Okay, so talk about that. So talk about that project, and how did you get involved in it?
Well, that was just it happened that I got my first, based on a spec script called My Dog's on Fire, I got my first Hollywood job. I was 40 years old, and the job was working for Tony Scott. And Tony was the brother of Ridley, and Tony was a top commercial maker, as was Ridley, but Tony hadn't yet gotten a feature off the ground and was struggling to do so, and he liked my script and wanted me to rewrite it for him. So I actually got a paying job as a writer down in LA. I didn't live there, but I got an apartment for a while. And I knew who his brother was. He just made Alien, and I'd also seen his wonderful film Duelists. So I knew who Ridley Scott was. And he was in the pre-production on this huge picture that was called Blade Runner, and so on. And Tony introduced me to his brother. We went to a little screening of something called Mad Max that hadn't been released yet.
Oh, yeah.
And I felt, at any rate, we saw that, and I met a Ridley who was very terse, and so on. And then, but I never mentioned anything about wanting to know. I was listening to Kate Powers talk this morning, and she was talking about, well, she didn't think necessarily being aggressive was necessarily a great thing. And I was the world's most unaggressive person. When George Lucas, right after he made Star Wars, he was checking on local editors, and he had me come up to do some editing on little changes on THX. And I never dared mention to him that I was writing scripts or I had any script and on top of that, I fell asleep in the middle of THX. Didn't help either. So anyway, where was I going with that? It was going somewhere.
Blade Runner.
Blade Runner, yeah. So at any rate.
How you got the job.
All of us, I finished up for Tony, drove north, and I never, when something happens, it's good. I'm always very cautious about it. I never do count my chickens before the eggs hatch, or whatever the expression is. And so I never take good news with any sort of enthusiasm, but I drove up there, got into my house and stuff, and there was a phone call from LA that Ridley Scott wanted to talk to me about doing a rewrite on Blade Runner. And I literally screamed. Janet had never seen me do anything like that. I mean, that was like a promotion to the moon if I got that job. So I went down to LA and they put me up in this huge suite at the Chateau Marmont and sent the script over by messenger. And I read the script and I was brokenhearted. The script was so good, right? And there was nothing, you know, I didn't know what to do to make it better. And then Ridley and the producer, Michael Dealey, showed up and said, well, what did you think of the script? And I said, well, I think it's perfect. I wouldn't know how to make it better. And the beauty of that was that they wanted to hear that. I mean, this was their baby, and they'd been working on this for a long time. They didn't want to hear some smart ass tell them how, you know, you should do this and you should do that, and so on. And also, I was sufficiently I said, I don't know what I could do to make it better. And Michael Dealey said it, the biggest understatement ever made. He said, well, I think Ridley might have a few ideas. And of course, this was new to me. I didn't know that other people had ideas and not the writer. But at any rate, so that was the beginning of me working on as a rewrite on Blade Runner. So the people go to see Blade Runner because it has an extraordinary vision. It's not a great dramatic story. And the vision is Philip K. Dick, Hampton Fancher, and Ridley Scott. And I did a really good job on a production rewrite, working on character and stuff like that. But when people go to see Blade Runner, they're not going to see what I did. So there.
Well, yeah. I mean, that's modest, but I mean, I hate
no, it's true.
No, I know.
Right.
It's not, and I'll tell you why. Because you can be very modest about that. But I mean, if I look at your work, I mean, you create these worlds, right? Okay, you can say that, yeah, this was a great script that came to me, but you certainly had a hand in, like, shaping that world. And if it was a one-shot deal, if you were like the Knack,
Right.
you know, my Sharona of, you know, the 80s, and it was one shot and you were done, maybe that's true, but I look at Unforgiven, and that's a complete world that you created, and that's a script that came out of your brain, not somebody else's. And 12 Monkeys, the two of you that you worked on this thing, and you had what, La Jetée to draw from, right? But the world that you created is, I mean, it's I'm not wrong, right, everybody? I mean, Blade Runner is a film that, right? Yeah, I mean, it's a film that really, like, stays with people, and you're getting a 13-year-old that's gonna. I'm telling you, he's gonna love the thing, and that's
my
that's something that
grandson
goes.
thought it was boring. So whatever. We didn't say we weren't good writers. I would just say I did a good production rewrite. I did good work on the characters, but that vision is definitely not mine.
But it certainly blew up. I mean,
it's
it
awesome.
launched your career.
I did launch my career, and I was so lucky to be on that job. I didn't know it till years later how lucky I was. And in fact, if you read William Goldman, you'll find where he talks about, I can't remember the big producer he was with, but he was in the car with him, and his picture was going into production, and the producer said, you just jumped over all that other bullshit. And indeed, that was the fact, that once I had a credit on a picture that size and that thing, I had an entree that was very, very valuable and very good. And just as if one of you got a credit on one of these huge pictures coming out that are coming out, it would put you in a place. Now the business has changed so much; it wouldn't be the same place I was in, but it nevertheless, it was a huge step for me.
Sure. So before we get to that stuff, can we talk a little bit about the documentary work that you did? The Day After Trinity was a film that you both were. Can you talk a little bit about that?
It's about one of the best credits we've got.
Yeah,
if any, you know, I mean, we're so proud of that picture, and we did it for the great documentarian John Else, who's made many documentaries, and you'll see his name on many, many others just with the thank yous, because he's an important person in the documentary world. And he wanted to make this film, and he wanted me to edit it, and he said maybe I should co-write it, maybe I would write it with him or something. And Janet said, what the hell? She says, I'm the one who knows about Oppenheimer, not David, right? So all of a sudden it's the three of us doing it, because John said, yeah, you're right, you know. And so the three of us were doing it. And
I think the big lesson from that is not necessarily that documentary, but David, because we needed money, took a job teaching film production at Stanford. He didn't know much more than the kids he was teaching, and so had to stay up all night the night before. No, wait a minute, and I'm just saying.
It's too late to keep them.
And it was a time in which his TAs went on to be really, really good, important filmmakers, and they hired us.
Yeah.
They just
That was
kept
cool.
hiring
That's
us.
cool.
And we've found that over and over again, that the person that you're sitting next to, or the person that you say, yeah, I'll come and I'll do it next Saturday, I'll do it, right, and everything, that you're going to go with them.
Yeah.
And in LA, when you go in and there's the assistant saying, would you like water or whatever, and you have to sit there for 15 minutes, she or he is not going to be an assistant
Right.
long.
Be nice to them.
Right. Well, just, find out, have you read my script and everything? And it's like some of them say, yes, right? And then you start having, they're going to hire you in a couple of years.
It's funny, I have conversations with, I've had a bunch the past month with students that are seniors in high school debating about whether to go to film school or not at all, not to go to college at all. And I'll save my money and make a film and blah, blah, blah. And I use that as kind of, I'm pro go to school, because of you're going to be in this environment where all the people you're around are kind of doing the same thing, thinking the same things, and you're going to make these connections that will follow you the rest of your life if you're lucky. And so that's really encouraging. Can we then move to? I reread the script title has changed a bunch, right? It was originally called The Cut Horror Murders, right?
The Cut Horror Killings.
The Cut Horror Killings, which is box office gold, that title to me. And but then it changed to the William Money Killings, right?
Right.
And then the Unforgiven. Can you talk about that script? Was floating around for 10, 15 years or so? Is that?
No, it wasn't floating.
Well,
Not floating, but
it
you
floated.
wrote
It floated
before
from
it got
70. It
produced.
floated from 76 till about 1985, when Francis Coppola optioned, or 84 when
Yeah.
Francis Coppola optioned it, and I did a day's rewriting on that occasion, and that's when we kept looking for another title, because William Money Killings is a great title if you've already seen it, but it's useless if you haven't seen it yet, or read it. So I agreed that it wasn't the right title, but we couldn't come up with, we came up with Horror's Gold, we came up with William Money Killings, we fiddled around, and it was the next year when Francis dropped the option and that Clint Eastwood bought the script and said he was going to make it, but then he didn't make it for a long time. And when he did make it, I didn't meet him till after he'd shot the picture, but we talked on the phone a number of times. And he did talk to me about, he wanted to call it Unforgiven. And I didn't think that was a particularly good title, but on the other hand, it's a bad idea to be negative about something when you don't have something better to offer. If I'd had a better title, I could have, said, well, you don't think such and such would be better, right? But I said, yeah, and also Clint Eastwood's an intimidating guy to talk to, so you want to be. So at any rate, I just said, yeah, Unforgiven, that sounds okay, or something. I didn't fake great enthusiasm, and as years went by, and so many things happened, I think it's the perfect title for the movie. But it took me a long time to get there.
Now you wrote that in the 70s, you say. Now, do you think that the film is about characters that, I don't know, they're not good or evil, one side. I mean, there's a lot of, it's a lot of gray in that. I mean, one of the, the heroes, so to speak, is Little Bill, who is the most sadistic person in the film, really, and he's the law. And the Clint Eastwood character, he starts off as trying to be such a good person, but then he reveals this, hellish side of himself. And at that time in the 70s, there were scripts that were dealing with this kind of anti-hero. Taxi Driver is the one that would come to mind.
That's the one that inspired Unforgiven, actually.
Okay. So can you I don't see that as much anymore, especially nowadays. I mean, it's pretty clear who the good guys are and who the bad guys are in film.
Well, you see it on television, for one thing.
In television,
and you
sure.
see it in the independent films, like Alexander Payne is fantastic at dealing with stuff like that. Quentin Tarantino does a pretty good job of dealing with that. So
also foreign films, the Iranian film, The Separation. I mean, it's like who's all good or all bad. I mean, things keep changing. It's like people in other countries are doing fantastic things.
and so on. But you're right. I mean, the big Hollywood films are very difficult. I mean, the marketing has changed the whole business so much that it is a different business than the one Jan and I started out in, and we wouldn't even, in the first place, we couldn't make it as screenwriters today. In the second place, we wouldn't try. So,
So why do you say that, though? Why do you say that?
well,
Like, because the industry is so, like your style and what you're attracted to is.
when we were coming up in the films of the 60s and 70s, and they were exciting, and you could have your cake and eat it too. You could make a film that was really good, right, and get rich. And obviously it wasn't easy. I'm not suggesting for a minute that you could just go and do that because that's what you wanted to do. But on the other hand, it was a great aspiration. You sit there and I didn't know how to sell anything or anything, so I'd just write a script thinking it was going to make me rich and famous, and then nobody'd read it, so I'd be writing the next one because that would make me rich and famous. So the point is that there was an aspiration there that was not cynical or at least not in my book, saying I like the movies, right? So I wanted to write those pictures. If it was today, the things, now I could never do this, and Janet maybe could do it, I don't know, but I mean, when I taught at Stanford, they were all talking about this student or TA who'd been there the year before, named David Chase, who was making these gangster things. Well, David Chase is, I mean, wow.
Yeah.
And Vince Gilligan and David Simon, I mean, the things they're doing those are the things that are as exciting as what we were seeing on the big screen when we were coming up. And I would be aspiring to those, or the other alternative is either write novels, because novels are a source of material, because marketing has made it so nobody wants to do originals mostly. And it was tough enough in the old days. Now it's, whew.
I think one of the biggest changes for us has to do within Hollywood now. They're dealing with an international market, so that when you go in and they're talking to you, or when they call us and everything, they throw in this word China. China wants to see this script of yours, right? It's like China is almost like a studio or a person. It's like China. It's like, but the Chinese people and the revenue coming from China is formidable. So if I were a studio executive, I would care about what China wanted too. And they don't want the small films that we were writing, or the quirky ones that we were writing.
We can't write a good movie for Chinese people. We can in writing big international movies for 19-year-olds, which is the sort of the main focus, is not an area of our expertise either. We don't dislike those movies. I loved Iron Man, but and would love to have written it, frankly, but it's not something we're good at. Plus, nobody's asking us, and a bunch of other things. So it's just, if we were coming up now, I think either that or people who direct their own films. I mean, James Cameron is a really good writer. I like his storytelling techniques and how he writes, but I don't think he's better than me or Jan. But when James Cameron writes a script, he's got James Cameron to direct it.
Right.
And Dave and Jan, we couldn't direct it.
Right. Well, Dave and Jan, let's talk about the starting point for 12 Monkeys. And what was it about? Correct me if I'm wrong. Chris Marker had La Jetée sort of greenlit to be a science fiction film somewhere at the time. And how did it come to you?
That wasn't the way it happened.
Okay, so how did it happen? How did the Chris Marker film turn into 12 Monkeys?
Somebody came to us and said they could set up with a studio a remake of this film, La Jetée. We live in Northern California, not LA. We're 400 miles away from LA. Small university, art town, art movie theaters. Everyone in Berkeley had seen La Jetée, but not us. We had small babies at the time, and this is before videotapes and DVDs. If you didn't get to the movie theater, that was it. It was over. And so we said, but we've not seen it. So they sent us a DVD of a very bad dub.
Actually, a VHS.
Oh, a VHS.
And a really bad VHS.
A very bad VHS. And we looked at it, and it's 30 minutes stills, one little moving part.
Yeah.
Right?
Black and white.
You probably thought there was something wrong with the VCR.
In French.
Yeah, in French. And it's like, We thought, this is a masterpiece. This is an absolute masterpiece. One, why would you want to do an American version of it? And two, how could you do it? It's
Well, also we thought that's true, but we also thought if there is an American version of this,
Right.
James Cameron already made it with Terminator,
Right.
which we thought and still
we
think
loved
is a
it.
great
Right.
film, both of those Terminators. So,
So we
it's
said-
been done. We're
Right.
you know, even if anybody had the balls to make this thing, he did it. So what's the point?
So they said, when we said, no way, they said, oh, come on, you guys, we can get this set up. We're almost right there, ready to set it up.
And they've
right?
been communicating with faxes with Chris Marker.
Right, yeah. And so it's like we said, and we've done this several times now, what if someone kidnapped our kids and said we had to come up with a story? What story would we come up? So we went away for a weekend, which was rather rare for us, and holed up and came up with a story and came back and said, okay, you guys, we have a story. See if you like this. That's what we said to the producers. This is fantastic. This is great. We go down to Los Angeles. They fly Chris Marker in. We're staying in the same hotel. And then we find out Chris Marker hates Hollywood. He hates lawyers. He hates producers. He's not going to give away the rights.
And he hasn't agreed to do
He
this at all.
hasn't
They
agreed to
never
do
agreed
this.
to do it.
Okay.
He doesn't want to do this. On the other hand, he did take the money and come over, right?
well,
So he's in the
I don't-
hotel,
Did
and
he take money at that
well,
point?
to come over.
Oh, yeah, he took the
didn't-
flight.
Yeah,
Well, it was
he
a free
took the
flight, yeah.
And so we're down in the lobby, and we're thinking, this is a waste of everybody's time. And we ran into a guy named Tom Luddy, who's a person he's the head of the Telluride Film Festival. And he's put on a lot of shows in Berkeley, movies, and started the Pacific Film Archive,
And worked for
et cetera.
Francis Coppola as a producer.
Worked
right?
for Francis Coppola as a producer, and he said, hey, what are you guys doing down here? And we said, oh, well, and we told him the story and everything. He said, oh, wait a minute, I'll take care of that. He said, tell you what, Francis is in town, we'll have dinner, right? Okay, so we have dinner.
And Chris was a good friend of his. As he
Chris
was a good friend of
loved-
all the Europe. He played
Yes.
golf with Kurosawa. Tom Luddy
Right.
played golf with Kurosawa. All the European directors knew him, and Chris Marker knew him very well.
Yes,
right?
and Chris loved Francis and loved Tom Luddy. So we have this big dinner at a Chinese restaurant in Los Angeles, and we get there, no producers, no lawyers, a whole bunch of directors and writers, and Francis at the head of the table, right? And Francis is mostly interested in what we're going to eat. And so he wants the chef to come out, and the chef and Francis confer while we all just busy, right? And Francis says, okay, the food's coming, and there's going to be wine and everything. And so the food starts coming. It's absolutely amazing. Chris is down here. At a certain point, Francis looks up and says, Chris. And Chris says, yes, Francis, yes, Francis. Jan and Dave want to write your script, write your movie. Okay. He said, but no contracts,
No lawyers.
no lawyers. I go, oh. He ended up signing a contract with Universal on a napkin.
And it was to our producer's greatness
Yeah.
that he managed to get that through the legal department at Universal.
Right.
'Cause, but at any rate, Chris was a magnificent person. I mean,
And
he
we
was,
became friends and
Jan
we're
made him
so-
sound a little meek there. He's not a meek person. It's true that he was impressed with Francis, but the fact is he was a
He
very
was.
proud and distinguished man.
Yes.
And he was a great man. Yeah.
So what was that process like? Talk about your process, the way you two work together. And in particular, 12 Monkeys. So did you go back to that original draft, the My Kids Are Kidnapped draft?
No, well, yes, back to
Oh,
the
yeah.
original ideas that we'd had. And when we do that, then at that point we start trying to write an outline, which we often do in close proximity, right? Spending a lot of time yelling at each other and so on, and then running off to the other room to write down something and come back and argue for it. But the outline is a beginning, and then we have different ways of working. Sometimes one of us goes off. In the old days, more often, there would be one of us writing the first act up in their office, and I'd be down in my office way downstairs writing the second act, or vice versa. And it would take some weeks, but we wouldn't do it. We don't talk about it while we're having dinner and breakfast and all that stuff. I mean, nothing but some weeks we'd schedule a formal meeting and go over those and figure out.
They're bloody.
Yeah, more often now, we both write the first act.
Right.
And then after the 2 or 3 weeks that it takes, we call this meeting, and that's, it's like hell. And we go back and forth because obviously everything I've written is perfect. And so on and so forth. But criticism does not sit well with me, and so on and so forth. But the fact is, of course, everything I've written isn't perfect, and we have to get past that. And we go back and forth, who's got the right character, who's figured this out, who's figured that out. We even went in one of the main characters, the one played by Brad Pitt, was stolen from one of Janet's originals that she'd written before. And it was my idea, we steal it. I said, hey, remember that guy? Let's get him in here. So
we do that, by the way. We take things, characters that we've got in other scripts that didn't sell, right? And you say, hey, you know, he'd be great here. He'd be absolutely great.
Do you write with actors in mind ever?
No, I think once
Not
we did or
usually.
something because there was some reason that we had no choice. That was who the actor was going to be, so there's no point in erasing his head, but we try not to. We don't want that encumbering the script.
I just remember once, I think I read somewhere about Hero and Dustin Hoffman and that script.
I didn't write it for him, but I always sort of wanted him for it. Well, there was a lot of Ratso Rizzo in the character, and so you know, Dustin created Ratso Rizzo as a character on the screen, which was a big problem because when Dustin was doing the part, he absolutely did not want to imitate something he'd done before, which is typical of actors and understandable since you don't want to write the same script you wrote before. Why would an actor want to play the same character? So at any rate, so there was a lot of. It wasn't like a brand new idea, but it wasn't like I always imagined Dustin as
the hero there.
yeah, but with Bernie LaPlante, yeah.
The working with Terry Gilliam, was there a good give and take there, or was it just? I mean, it's another visionary. I'm assuming Terry Gilliam brought. You say Ridley Scott brought this thing. I assume.
I think that the miracle for us is that Terry Gilliam is a very talented writer, and yet he was given our script, and he was just very nice about doing our script. Doesn't mean that we didn't have conferences before and talk about some of the things that he wanted to do, but the script was the script.
Yeah.
And so we were very lucky, and he said, you are the writers, and but he was the director, and he put a lot of quirkiness into it that we hadn't had, and it's better for it, much better for it.
And he did other beautiful things like that angel and stuff rising up there. Wow. So
and we had a lot of the music in, that's what we wanted, but he added some music too.
Right.
And that was
so it was absolutely delightful, and we didn't realize until after the picture was made just how lucky we are, because we thought other people could do it. I was hot for Tony Scott to do it and everything, but I don't think anybody could have handled that as well. It's not a great script in that it's way too complex and confusing and lots of things. So to have somebody who's also a visionary but is such a master storyteller, he made it work in ways that just blew our minds. And afterwards we realized, whoo, we dodged that bullet.
and also the actors were fantastic.
Oh, the
we were
actors,
so lucky in that. Bruce Willis was fantastic in that film.
Right.
It's
And
like when we were at rehearsals, and you would say, I just don't understand this guy. I don't understand this guy. So we talked and talked and talked and talked, and then all of a sudden he said, I got it. You say, what? He said, I'm 8 years old. Right? He said, I'm a grown man, but I went down when I was about 8 years old. I'm 8 years old. We say, you got it.
Yeah, and that was the first. Brad Pitt was nominated for Best Supporting too.
Yeah. And Madeline Stowe carries that picture. I mean, the stuff she does in that picture is amazing, and because she doesn't do anything flashy, but she is so solid and so persuasive. And there was one scene where we needed a little bit of cautious expository dialogue to show why she wasn't going to run away when he actually walked away from her, even though obviously her motivation would be to run away, and that's what she'd do. And she started saying she didn't want that line of dialogue, and we were really you know, I mean, we're polite, but we thought, you got to have it. You can't confuse an audience that way. They've got to understand. You can't have somebody just do something that doesn't make any sense. She said, I can do it, I can do it. We watched it on the screen. She sold it perfectly, without any dialogue. She sold. Nobody ever asked why she didn't run away. At least I didn't hear anybody. She knew what she could do as an actor and what she could make people understand, and I would never have believed it. She's a fantastic actor.
Yeah. You're both very modest about your work. I mean, I've heard you say, like, 12 Monkeys is not a very good script. I would argue that one. But, I mean, you must have some scripts that you have. Every time I talk to folks up here, I always find it really fascinating that they have this other body of work, too, that has been unproduced and that they like even more than some of the stuff that's gone
Best
up there.
script we ever wrote was To the White Sea, an adaptation of
James
Dickey's book, To the White Sea.
He did Deliverance.
Yeah, he did Deliverance, a very strange book, and so idiosyncratic that our pride is that I think we did a superb job of craftsman-like fixing it dramatically for the screen, and even improved a little bit on some of his own dramatics, but none of the creative stuff, none of the vision, none of the stuff that's in it is ours. We translated Dickey to the screen because his point of view is so extraordinary and so different, and not something we could ever even think of. We just went.
And why do you think that has not?
Well, it got held up. The Coen brothers were going to do it, but then they got writing other things and everything, and Brad Pitt was going to do it. Now Brad's too old, and it's like, and so that fell apart. I mean, screenwriters, you write screenplays, and they're like having children. You have a child, right? And it's going to have a life of its own. And I think it's mostly your mother and father that need to have it made, that you don't really need to have it made. I mean, if it gets made, how wonderful. But then it's a grown-up kid, you know, and you're on to other projects. And we've been very lucky that we've had work continually, and not all of our work has gotten produced. We have dozens and dozens of unproduced things. But we've done production rewrites on other people's that have gotten, and we've done first drafts that other people have done and gotten credit for. You know, we're working writers.
But To the White Sea, if you were to think of it in the bigger picture of the movie business, it's a lot like, not in terms of subject or anything, but it's like There Will Be Blood. I mean, it requires an actor so passionate to be that young man who's Muldrow, who's in To the White Sea, and a director who goes there, because it's not, you know, the idea that a commercial picture is today. Then there's also the script, the wonderful script that we're the producers of. And we have to be the worst producers who've ever, you know, producers are people who are aggressive and don't take no for an answer and just keep pursuing something. And Jan and I go, no, okay. And, we don't even have the energy to go out to people anymore. We fear rejection so much. So we have a wonderful adaptation of James Young's Nico, The End, which is languished for many years because we can't get it set up. We deliberately bought the novel because it wasn't a studio picture. We knew that if we tried to get somebody to pay us to do it as studio and pay our high fee and everything, that number one, if they did it, we'd make a lot of money, but it either wouldn't get made or it'd get changed so much that even if it somehow did get made, it'd be so awful we wouldn't want anything to do with it, except that, of course, we'd have the money.
But no one wants to make it. It's about a young guy at Oxford. He's going to be the first kid in his family to get a big degree and everything. But he plays piano to earn some money, and so this producer comes to him and says, hey, kid, how about going on this tour with us as the piano player? He says, yeah, sure, that's what he'll do for the summer, and then go back to Oxford. He hooks up with a junkie band that's doing this tour, and they're all heroin addicts. And it's like, and he's a fish out of water, and it's like that's so much of our experience in Berkeley. One, we're fish out of water in LA, right? But in Berkeley, all these kids went off to become rock and roll stars and everything, never knew what was going on. Came to Europe, and there was drugs and women and syphilis and gonorrhea, and right, came back home. And so it just, we liked it. We thought it was great. But Hollywood, no way. Right? So there's that.
Nico was a fantastic person, and and this young man, James Young, did not treat her reverentially like the poor great artist who's suffering from her excesses. On the contrary, he saw her as something of a bitch. And so it was, anyway.
That's
So,
it.
Can you, I'm going to have to wrap up in a sec, but I wanted to talk about what's going on now. I know the 12 Monkeys is a sci-fi series, and everything seems to be moving towards these serialized dramas. Can you talk a little bit about that? We talked about it last night a little bit, but I think the audience would love to hear how hands-on you've been with that project.
Oh, none, none. We have nothing to do with 12 Monkeys, the TV show. I mean, I guess there's some characters and stuff that we originated, but when we were originally asked, what did we think of 12 Monkeys for TV, we said, that's a terrible idea. Now, we may have been wrong. I mean, that was just snotty Dave and Jan. But later, when we were showed the spec script these guys had done, we didn't like the premise. And we still don't like the premise of the TV show, but I must say they've done a good job with it. I mean,
we saw the pilot. We thought
they've made an entertaining show, and that's their job, and they've done a good job with it. So,
but we've decided that we're going to try and do some television. So, and it's a long story why we're doing it, but we have done a pilot and a Bible and an outline, and now it's out there. And it's only because we said we're old, we have other things to do, we're going to retire. And we told our agent, we don't want to do any more, no more meetings, no more any of this stuff. If some director that we really admire calls us and says he wants us to do something, then we'll consider it. Justin Lin called the next day and said, hey, you guys.
boy, was that luck.
Yeah, how would you like to, it's like, well, Justin Lin, we had just seen his Furious 5.
Furious 5.
Yeah.
Cool.
And said, oh, well, this is an interesting guy. And we saw a film that he had done for Sundance that was really interesting. We thought, he's an interesting guy. So we said we would tackle that.
But what we're going to do, and we know you got to go to Q&A,
No.
but what we got to do is this next session is going to be about the writer's room. And we have no idea what a writer's room's like. And we were just hearing this morning somebody saying that you go in there and you have to not take anything personally and you have to be this
Impossible,
way. And I'm
right?
thinking, I feel, holy God, I couldn't last 30 seconds in the writer's room, and now we're trying to write TV. So we're going to come to this next session and try and figure this out.
Great. Well, I'd like to open it up to questions. If there are folks, and there's the light going, and I think there are probably a few. It sounds like kind of like Chris Marker. You're saying we don't want lawyers or stuff, and you're back there.
You guys can hire us.
Yeah, we're for sale.
Oh, that's right. There's a one from the. Yeah, how did you two meet? Was it on fill us in.
Oh, I came in.
Or can you not?
I came in to do the 3 to 11 shift as an orderly in a hospital, and the other orderly was laughing at me, and I'm going, "What's your problem?" And he said, "Look at the duty roster." And I looked, and it said I had the operating room that night, which is neither the best shift in the hospital or the worst. It wasn't a big deal. I said, "What's the big deal?" And he says, "Look at the head operating room there. Says that bitch Bibi." And I said, "Well, I'd never met that bitch Bibi." So in the end, they had an operation that night, which meant I had to go up and scrub the operating room out, which was not a big deal. That's certainly not the worst thing you could have to do. I scrubbed the operating room out. Now I go to the head operating room nurse to get the pro forma approval because I washed the floor. Just let her know, checks it off. She says, "Do it again." 56 years she's paid for that. 56 years, and I'm not letting her go. Okay, we've got a question.
Yes.
I was wondering if you could speak to the fact that you sort of started sort of at a later time in your lives in Hollywood, and how that experience was different for you if you had started at a younger age.
Well, I think we both would have been much happier to have started at a younger age, and we just didn't know how to do it. And as I say, this was there were people who went to, Jan tried to get me to go to UCLA Film School, but they wanted me to go back and get more courses, and I just was so, I had 2 little kids and so on, and I just didn't want to be back in school again, so I didn't do it. And so we're stuck up in Northern California. I'm editing news film on single system negative.
Actually, you were doing documentaries, PBS documentaries.
Well, I worked on some, yes.
Yeah.
So I wasn't.
So
but,
we were doing things, but just not in Hollywood.
Yeah.
And there were a lot of people from down there that were coming out of the film schools and coming up to Northern California. So there was starting to be a film community up
Isn't
there
there
too.
Coppola, the Zoetrope?
Zoetrope
Yes,
was
in
it,
fact,
yeah.
I was working for a magazine and interviewed him when he was just starting
Okay.
Zoetrope. But so it was difficult. We would have been better off on some levels being in part of that community, because that's what, if you look back at those people who were, they were a community. Milius, Coppola, Lucas, all of those people were part of a group. They all knew each other. George married an editor who was a wonderful editor and so on. So they all were part of a team, and to this day they all know each other and interact. So we would have been much better off on that level that way. But that's one of those things, you can't calculate everything. And we had luck and things worked out. And in some ways, because I don't do well in those things, and Jan does very well with people, but I don't, and maybe I would have just flamed out going down there. I don't know.
I think that what the big difference, I don't think it has to do with what we would have done or whatever. It's just you guys have technology now that we didn't have, and the technology has made all of the change. We have a 15-year-old granddaughter who's making films. I mean, you know, it's like she's literally making films and putting them up on Facebook. I don't mean that they're great films or anything, but it's like,
They're
oh,
beautifully
yeah, they're
done, though.
beautifully done.
Wow.
And they have access to all of the movies, have the special things where you can find out how you can do Orphan Black.
Right.
I mean, think of it.
Yeah.
Whoa.
So anyway, I hope we answered that.
Another one?
I'd like to ask you something very, very specific, if you remember, and it's the genesis of one line, and possibly, if you remember the genesis of it, how it informed the specific story you were trying to tell. And it's from Unforgiven, and it's one of my favorite lines of all time. And it's a hell of a thing to kill a man.
Right.
When you do, you take away everything he has and everything he
Right.
will.
Or the origin of it?
Just
Well-
creatively,
Right. Well, geez, that's a tough question. I'd seen Taxi Driver, which was the first thing that gave permission to be serious in an entertainment movie, in my view, right? Before that, I didn't want people killed in anything I wrote, because nobody in movies dies real. I mean, at least I didn't think so. And here was an entertainment movie that did things, it was entertaining and it did all that weird stuff that Travis Bickle did. And also that line that Travis says, I want to be a person like other people. That was a theme for me when I wrote Unforgiven, of who William Money was, right? He was Travis Bickle old, still trying to be like other people. And the particular line you're talking about, again, I had also been very influenced by Glendon Swarthout's book, The Shootist, which was made into a movie that Glendon Swarthout's son adapted. And the movie was a charming Hollywood film. And it was a good film. There was nothing bad about it. But The Shootist, the book that Glendon Swarthout wrote, was dark and scary. And the character played by Ron Howard was a psychopathic brat. And so it was a very different thing. And that had a lot of influence on me. And I thought about this fellow, William Money. And I thought that one of the original scenes I had for it was showing him dying and afraid that he was dying. I just hadn't seen anybody do that in a Western before, and I felt certain that people who were, the men who carried guns around and shot other people were also afraid of death like all of us are. And then subsequently, as things developed, he was in a position suddenly where he was explaining killing to this kid. And this is what Money himself had finally learned, to a certain extent, what you were taking away from someone. Is that answering your question? I'm not, okay.
It's such a great
And
film.
God bless Clint Eastwood for keeping the dialogue the way it was. I mean, bless him.
The way it deals with violence in that film, how violence creates more violence.
Right.
And I think it's just such a beautiful, I thought you were going to ask the line, where the kid goes, "Well, I guess they had it coming," and Clint Eastwood looks up and he goes, "We all got it coming, kid." And it's like such a great line. It's and the way he delivers it too is so like spot on. Is that?
Yeah, the reason I asked is, I mean, that's one movie that thematically, I mean, it's just so strong and centered all the way through. And I think as experienced writers or as first-time writers, we often all lose sight of, you know, what is the story about? Forget about the plot. What is it really about? And for me, in Unforgiven, that not only just summed up Unforgiven, but it summed up, you know, just one of the, I guess, the universal struggles we all have.
And that was
as
nominated for an
life and
Oscar,
death, so.
and that was probably pretty cool too,
That
right?
was, yes, that's thrilling. I don't want to make people cynical or anything, but I can't tell you how much it means to have somebody like Clint Eastwood get it and then make it and not mess it up. All screenwriters, and there are a lot of good screenwriters and so on, and all of them have wonderful scripts that nobody messes up a script deliberately, but they've been taken over by directors who don't get it and try their best but just blow it. I mean, God, there was a scene I wrote that I think was one of the finest, most original things, and the director, nice fellow and everything, but just didn't get it. And it's gone forever, and it'll never be on the screen. But I'm just saying Clint Eastwood deserves a lot of credit for that line because he got it up there.
Let's take one more question if we can get, and then we'll wrap it up. Are you wrapping me up already? Am I already getting wrapped? I guess I'm getting wrapped.
You've been wrapped.
Oh, I've been wrapped. Well, thank you very much. Give a round of applause. Stick around for the next panel.